When we talk about learning a language, we often imagine textbook, grammar charts, and endless vocabulary list. We think of repetition, drills, and well-rehearsed dialogues. But if you pause for a moment and picture how people actually use language in the world, outside of classrooms and exams, you start to see something much more dynamic. You see people doing things with language, designing, building, collaborating, questioning, and creating. That idea that language is learned through purposeful doing sits at the heart of project-based language learning. It's a philosophy that reshapes the classroom from a place of passive instruction into a workshop of curiosity, experimentation, and collaboration. It invites both teacher and learner to step into roles that are less defined by hierarchy and more by shared discovery. The roots of project-based learning stretch back more than a century to the early pragmatics and constructivists. People like John Dewey and William Kilpatrick, they argue the real education begins not in the delivery of facts, but in the experience of inquiry. Dewey wrote that learning happens best when students confront real problems, when knowledge emerges from doing, reflecting, and refining. For him, the classroom was a microcosm of life, a space where ideas are tested, mistakes are valuable, and meaning is constructed through activity. So, this is how we start this episode. So, as I always say, sit down comfortably, grab yourself a coffee, and let's get started. Woo!
Let's go!
Continuing with the idea, when we transport those principles into language education, something remarkable happens. Language, which is itself an instrument of social action, becomes the medium and message of learning. Students aren't merely talking about the language. They are using it to achieve meaningful goals. Imagine a secondary classroom in Korea, where students work in groups to design a cultural festival. They write invitation, plan performance, create promotional posters, and prepare food menus, all in English. Every step requires communication, negotiation, and decision-making. Grammar lessons are no longer abstract. They become tools to make meaning precise. Vocabulary isn't memorized for a quiz. It's chosen intentionally to reach an audience. This is what makes project-based learning so powerful. It places communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking at the center of the process. These are the famous 4 C's, right? The 21st century learning skills. And they align beautifully with the nature of language itself. Communication. Students must articulate ideas clearly and appropriately to achieve their project goals. Collaboration. Projects demand shared responsibility and negotiation of meaning. Language in its most social form. Creativity. Learners design, innovate, and produce something original, whether a video, campaign, or exhibition. Critical thinking. They evaluate sources, solve real-world problems, and make informed decisions using language as the tool for reasoning. And in traditional classrooms, these competencies are often treated as extras, right? Nice to have, but secondary to grammar accuracy. In a project-based classroom, they are the curriculum itself. Now, From a theoretical standpoint, project-based learning fits perfectly within a constructivist paradigm. Learners construct knowledge actively rather than receive it passively. And that construction happens through social interaction, which ties it closely to Vygotsky's sociocultural theory. Now, talking a little bit about it. Vygotsky reminded us that learning doesn't occur in isolation. It emerges through dialogue, collaboration, and shared problem solving within the zone of proximal development. In other words, when learners work on projects, they are continuously co-constructing language. They scaffold one another, they model phrasing, reformulate sentences, and even negotiate meaning in context. It's the most natural form of peer scaffolding imaginable. Not a teacher imposed, but a genuine linguistic ecosystem. Now, let's connect this to Bloom's taxonomy for a moment. If you visualize Bloom's cognitive hierarchy, from remembering, understanding, and applying, up through analyzing, evaluating, and creating, you can almost see how project-based learning climbs that ladder naturally. At the start, students recall and understand key language points. Then they apply them in context, perhaps drafting an interview script or designing survey questions. As the project deepens, they analyze data, evaluate feedback, and finally create a final product. You say it, you name it, a website, a report, a play, a podcast. Every tier of Bloom's is embedded in the process, culminating at the highest level, which is creation. And that's one of the most striking things about PBL. Creation isn't final, optional activity. It's the engine of learning. And now, let's look at the CEFR now. The Common European Framework of Reference. Oh my goodness. If you've ever read the CEFR descriptors carefully, you'll notice something interesting. They're built around task and communication, not grammar checklist. Statements like can describe experiences, can express opinions, or can write a simple connected text on familiar topics. These are inherently projectable. They invite us to design experiences where those competencies can come alive. Now, for example here, a B1 level learner working on a travel blog project will easily address dozens of CEFR descriptors, describing experiences, narrating past events, giving advice, expressing preferences. Each blog post becomes evidence of real communicative achievement, not just linguistic accuracy. Now, let's bring this into the life of a classroom. Picture a group of intermediate learners in Chile, working on a project titled Voices of Our City. Their goal, to create a digital magazine highlighting untold stories from their local community. They conduct interviews, take photographs, write articles, and design layouts. Over several weeks, they are immersed in authentic communication, discussing, planning, revising, and publishing in English. The teacher's role shifts dramatically. Instead of standing at the front, explaining verb tenses, the teacher moves through the room as a consultant, guiding, questioning, and providing linguistic support precisely when needed. Mini lessons emerge organically. A 10-minute pause to review reported speech after a student interview or a quick pronunciation clinic before recording a podcast segment. Language instruction becomes responsive, not prescriptive. And this is what we might call the pedagogical choreography of PBL. The teacher designs the stage, sets the condition, and then allows students to move, improvise, and collaborate, stepping in at the right moment to sustain rhythm and depth. Of course, there's always a concern among teachers. Will they really learn the grammar? The answer is yes. And perhaps more meaningfully, grammar in a project based context is not divorced from use. It's encountered, applied, and refined within the communicative need. When a student says, "Teacher, how do I say this politely in English?" that question arises from intent, from a need to make meaning appropriate. The resulting mini lesson has emotional weight. It's immediately relevant and thus far more memorable. Now, there's another subtle but vital aspect here: engagement. Now, let's turn a little bit scientific here. Neuroscience tells us that motivation and memory are deeply intertwined when learners are emotionally and cognitively engaged. When the task feels meaningful, dopamine levels rise, attention sharpens, and retention improves. Projects create these conditions naturally. They transform language learning from an obligation into an experience of purpose. Let's pause and think about that. Many of us grew up associating language classes with performance anxiety, the fear of mistakes, this sterile repetition of phrases, the sense that fluency was something distant and abstract. But in a project based environment, the emotional tone changes completely. Mistakes become part of the creative process. Peer correction feels natural, not punitive. The classroom hums with collaboration and laughter because language is being used for real, for something real. In fact, research in applied linguistics supports this. Studies on task based and project based learning show consistent gains not only in communicative competence, but in learner confidence and autonomy. Learners report feeling more ownership over their progress, which is amazing. More curiosity toward new vocabulary, and more willingness to take risk. And that idea of ownership is crucial. When students produce something tangible, a video documentary, a debate, an exhibition, they develop a sense of authorship. They can point to something and say, "I made this." In that moment, the language ceases to be a foreign code. It becomes a part of their creative identity. And there's a beautiful metaphor for this. Imagine language learning as a journey through a forest. Traditional instruction hands students a map and says, "Follow this path." Project-based learning says, "Let's build a path together." Along the way, students gather materials, which is grammar, vocabulary, expressions, not as a separate lesson, but as the tools they need to move forward. Each project becomes a piece of that trail. Unique, imperfect, but theirs. And yes, of course, to make this kind of learning sustainable, teachers need to design with intention. Projects can't just be random creative tasks. They must align with curricular goals, skill outcomes, and assessment criteria. That's where the idea of backward design comes in. Starting with the desired learning outcomes, identifying what evidence would demonstrate them, and then designing the project around those outcomes. In PBL, this alignment is both art and science. is the art of making learning feel authentic and the science of ensuring it meets linguistic objectives. For example, suppose your outcome is students will be able to express and justify opinions on social issues. You could design a project where learners create a short debate or just a podcast on topics like technology, sustainability, or equality. Along the way, you integrate mini lessons on opinion language, the scores markers, and tone. The final podcast becomes not just a product, but a performance of learning. And that connection between product and process is something we'll return to often in this episode. Because while the final artifact is rewarding, it's the journey, the drafts, the collaboration, the language negotiation that produces deep learning. And as we continue in this episode, we'll explore what makes an effective project from start to finish, from defining inquiry questions to scaffolding linguistic support, assessing both the process and the product, and fostering reflection that consolidates growth. But before we move there, let's pause and consider the emotional essence of PBL. It's joy, it's curiosity. It's the moment a shy student suddenly speaks up because they care about the topic. It's the pride of presenting a finished work that exists beyond the classroom. That's what we mean when we say project-based language learning engages and teaches at the same time. It doesn't ask students to choose between competence and creativity. It invites both to flourish together. Designing a language learning project begins not with content, but with a question. A good project is born of curiosity, the kind that invites exploration rather than prescribes an answer. In the tradition of inquiry-based education, we start with a guiding question that is both open-ended and linguistically fertile. It might be, how can we make our school greener? Or what stories does our city tell? Or what makes a good apology in different cultures? Each of these questions naturally demands language to investigate, to interview, to discuss, to report, to present. The teacher's task is to ensure that the question's cognitive challenge matches the learner's linguistic capacity. High enough to stretch, but not so high that frustration replaces engagement. From that starting point, the project unfolds through a series of phases that echo both Dewey's cycle of experience and Kolb's experimental learning model. Do, reflect, conceptualize, apply. In practical terms, those phases might look like this. For example, first, engagement. Students encounter the problem or challenge. Perhaps they watch a short video, analyze a local issue, or read an article that sparks discussion. In this stage, emotion is the hook. Neuroscience reminds us that attention follows emotion, and language follows attention. When learners care, they listen and speak more deeply. Second, planning. Here, students define objectives, distribute roles, and outline what language resources they'll need. The teacher acts as a linguistic architect, providing sentence frames, word banks, and mini lessons on useful structures. It's here that scaffolding quietly enters. The teacher provides temporary support that gradually fades as independence grows. Third, research and creation. This is the heartbeat of the project. Learners gather data, interview peers, draft scripts, rehearse dialogues, all this. The classroom buzzes with collaboration. Mistakes appear, glorious, meaningful mistakes. And with them come teachable moments. The teacher listens more than speaks, intervening strategically to model phrasing or mediate a misunderstanding. Fourth, presentation or publication. The project meets its audience, sometimes internal, sometimes public. Students might host a mini conference, record a podcast, mount an exhibition, or post their work online. This stage satisfies the human need for authenticity. When learners know someone beyond the teacher will hear or see their work, quality rises naturally. And finally, reflection. This phase is often skipped, yet it is where learning crystallizes. Reflection closes the experimental loop, what Kolb called abstract conceptualization. Students revisit questions like, what language did I learn? What strategies helped me communicate better? What would I do differently next time? Reflection turns experience into insight. If we look closely, these 5 phases align perfectly with Bloom's taxonomy as well, moving from understanding toward creation, and then cycling back through evaluation. They also mirror the CEFR action-oriented approach, in which learners are social agents, using language to accomplish tasks in specific context. So, as we close this exploration, I want you to imagine your next class not as a sequence of lessons, but as a story of learners discovering what they can do with language. A story where grammar and vocabulary are not ends in themselves, but companions on a journey toward self-expression. A story where your classroom becomes a space of meaning-making, empathy, and creativity. Maybe the project will be small. A student-made podcast, a class magazine, a digital exhibition. Maybe it will grow into something larger. A community initiative, a cross-border collaboration. Whatever its scale, remember that every project is an invitation for students to use language as a bridge between who they are and who they are becoming. And that's why project-based learning doesn't just engage and teach, it transforms. It cultivates learners who see language not as an academic subject, but as a living force, capable of connecting people, ideas, and worlds. So as you step into your next class, ask yourself, not what will I teach today, but what will my students create? Because in that act of creation, language finds its truest voice. Until next time, keep creating, keep connecting, and keep learning through doing.